The first part of the prophets we want to look at is what is called the former prophets. Now, these prophets are often not called prophets. These books of prophecy in the Christian framework is often not called prophecy at all, but often called history. And these are the books like Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. They are called the former prophets. Now, this needs to give us a clue straight away, because the problem for Christianity is that we've used these four books as history. And unfortunately, when we use the word history, we also then begin to think of them in the history of the common understanding of history. That history is somehow a chronicle of what actually happened, of the truth. Now, the problem with that is that all history comes from a perspective. There was a time when I had a car accident, and it was seen by 4 different witnesses. And it was so interesting to read the police reports afterwards, because each of the witnesses actually saw the accident in a slightly different way. And because of that, they each blamed somebody else for the accident. In the end, the insurance companies had to go with what they thought was the best understanding of that truth. But what they realized was that there was no real way to actually know at all what was happening. Because the one thing that we also couldn't know was the intent of each of the players involved in that particular witness of that history. The same thing is true in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Because what's begun to happen as we've done more archaeological digging within the Holy Land, as we've done more reading of other texts of the time, we realize that there are some problems with some of these texts. In fact, there's even some problems in the text themselves. Because if you read Joshua, you would be under the impression that when the Israelites came into the Holy Land, into Canaan, they killed off all the native population. However, 300 years later, we read in the book of Samuel that David was looking for a new capital, and he found it in the Jebusite city of Jerusalem. Now, how is it that 300 years later, David still had Jebusites living in Israel, if Joshua, 300 years before, had killed off everybody in the Holy Land? What that's led scholars to believe is that, in fact, Joshua might not have happened quite as simply as we read within the book of Joshua. Now, of course, some people may be throwing up their hands in horror, saying, well, what was the truth? What really happened? Well, the truth, as any historian will tell you, is very, very difficult to truly identify. And only if you're trying to write history. However, we've just said that Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were not written as history. They are written as prophecy. And therefore, for the writers were under no obligation either to themselves or to God or to their readers to write something that was about accuracy in terms of actual historical event. What they were trying to write was God's word to the people so that they could build their house of faith on the firm foundation, not of history, but of the law, of the Torah, of that which would bind us in relationship to God. So that has to change straight away the way in which you read Joshua or Judges or Samuel or Kings. That you don't read it saying this is what happened or this is a historical account. Instead, what you begin to do is you read it with the understanding of how is this story, God's word, helping me to live out Torah? How is this helping me to connect with Torah? How is this connecting me to the person and to the wisdom and to the mind of God? Now, admittedly, some of that's very hard. Any of you who've read the book of Judges will realize that that's a book filled with stories which are really MA rated. They are things that you don't really want to show to, or certainly not have your children read. And so we have to really struggle with them. And that brings us right back to the beginning of this course, where I was talking about the blessing of struggle. Where I was talking about the fact that we need to struggle with the Word to identify what God is speaking to us in them. We need to particularly do that with prophecy. Because otherwise what prophecy becomes is a pseudo-history, Or even worse than that, becomes this pseudo fortune telling, where we're waiting for particular things to happen in order to be able to see what the future is going to hold. The latter prophets is all about saying God was with us in the past, in the historical events of Israel. And because of that, we can understand His word to us in the present. In that way, David and Goliath becomes not just a story of this little boy killing a big giant, but rather becomes a voice of God speaking to us today in terms of how faith can overcome the realities of life, that can overcome the things that would want to take away our faith, that would want to rob us of faith. That how do we fight them? We fight them with the use of Torah. Those are the connections that we need to come to terms with if we're going to understand the latter prophets. They are all about that process of connection. It's within the latter prophets that we also get the iconic prophet. In fact, the prophet that becomes the prototype for all other prophets. And that, of course, is the prophet Elijah. It's Elijah that stands above as the one who is truly speaking God's word into the lives of the people in a time of great distress. A time when people were following after other gods. A time when, in fact, the faith wasn't being adhered to. You can imagine that the people who would have read that in the time of exile would have got a great sense of connection to Elijah. A great sense of saying, yes, we need to be like Elijah. We need to follow like Elijah. We need to have that single-minded devotion to God like Elijah. And yet, even in the stories of Elijah, we see his frailty. We see his fear. We see his lack of faith. And I love those passages because what it does for me is it says that even those who follow God aren't somehow superheroes. Rather, they are still frail human beings who are connected to God. That's really what the former prophets are about. It's about the frailty of humanity, about the absolute wonder of David, who was a friend of God, and yet at the same time was a murderer and an adulterer. We're talking about Solomon, who prayed for wisdom and had all that wisdom, and yet in the end threw it all away in favor of following after the desires of his flesh rather than the desires of relationship with God. We can see that in each of these we see fallible human beings, the real human beings who the prophets speak to and who God is speaking to help us to live out Torah, to help us to live out the foundation of faith. I believe that the latter prophets need to be not used as historical documents. What the latter prophets, or the former prophets need to be used as is not historical works, but prophecy. God speaking to us through the events of the past in order to help us in the present to develop our edifice, our building of faith.